The Japanese soldiers fought bitterly beside the Drake River in New Guinea. Hundreds of them crept forward in the darkness, their boots sinking deep into the muddy riverbank as they took up hidden positions under the faint glow of the midnight sun. Tall grass and reeds helped conceal them from enemy eyes, but no vegetation could hide the sounds of their heavy breathing or the soft thuds of exhausted men stumbling through the swampy ground. Officers strained their ears, listening for any hint that the enemy might have detected them. Sergeants moved quietly among their men, whispering orders to stay still and silent. The men of Major Moritoshi Kashi's 1st Allen 78th Infantry Regiment waited tensely for the command to attack, but fear was not the only thing they felt twisting in their stomachs. They were starving, their bellies ached with hunger, and their bodies trembled from weeks of eating nothing but grass, leaves, and insects. Supplies had long since run out, and the few remaining stores could not reach them through the thick jungles and flooded trails of New Guinea. They had survived only through sheer willpower and strict discipline, pushing their bodies far beyond the limits of endurance. Yet even with their warrior spirit, a haunting question lingered in their minds. Could courage alone defeat the powerful American forces that stood before them? Among the weary men crouched beside the river that night was one who still believed victory was possible. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the Japanese 18th Army, was the man behind this desperate operation. In his eyes, surrender or retreat was not an option. His forces had been cut off after massive Allied invasions along the northern coast of New Guinea in the spring of 1944. The landings at Hollandia and Itape had severed his connection with the rest of Japan's southern army. With no chance of reinforcement, no path for evacuation, and no supplies coming from the mainland, the 55,000 soldiers of the 18th Army were left stranded, abandoned by Imperial headquarters, isolated in one of the most unforgiving terrains on Earth. On April 22, 1944, American troops stormed ashore at Hollandia and Itape, backed by overwhelming air and naval power. From his headquarters at Wewak, General Adachi struggled to find any way to respond. His soldiers were starving, sick, and dying faster from disease and hunger than from bullets. Yet his honor and his training as a soldier would not allow him to sit and watch them perish without striking back. He considered his options. He could attack the Allied base at Itape, about 94 miles away, or he could attempt to lead his army through the jungle to rejoin Japanese forces far to the west. But both choices were nearly impossible. The code of Bushido that guided his life demanded that he act with courage, loyalty, and honor. To remain idle and accept death without battle went against every value he had ever held. The journey west would require crossing 600 miles of thick, mountainous jungle filled with disease, treacherous rivers, and enemy patrols. His men lacked food, medicine, and transport, and most were already exhausted from previous retreats across eastern New Guinea. Still, Adachi decided that if his men were to die, they would die fighting. His plan was simple but bold: attack the Allied airfields at Itape using his best infantry. He had just enough supplies to sustain the army for 2 months. If they succeeded, they could march west another 120 miles to capture Hollandia and resupply themselves with captured American stores. It was a desperate plan, one that relied more on the unbreakable fighting spirit of Japanese soldiers than on sound military logic. The man behind this plan, Hatazo Adachi, had lived his life shaped by the ideals of discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice. Born on June 17, 1890, in Tokyo, he was the son of an army officer. From childhood, he was taught the values of the samurai: endurance, respect, and the duty to die with honor if necessary. Tall, quiet, and serious, he appeared destined for military service. After graduating from the Tokyo Cadet Academy, he became a lieutenant in the Imperial Guards in 1910. His early career was marked by discipline and a belief that a soldier should never ask his men to do what he would not do himself. Those who served under him admired his bravery and fairness. During his service in Manchuria and later in China in the 1930s, Adachi showed remarkable courage. As a regimental commander, he often led attacks from the front lines, sharing the same dangers as his soldiers. He refused the comforts that came with his rank, choosing instead to eat and sleep beside his men. His face and neck bore scars from mortar explosions, and he walked with a limp, permanent reminders of the battles he had survived. Despite these wounds, his determination only grew stronger. By 1940, his leadership and dedication earned him promotion to lieutenant general. The following year, he was appointed Chief of Staff of the South China Area Army, where he led the 37th Division with great success. Later, he was given command of the newly formed 18th Army and sent to New Guinea, one of the harshest battlefields of the war. When Adachi arrived on the island in January 1943, he immediately realized the grim reality. Japanese forces were losing ground fast. Enemy troops had seized the vital port of Bua after a bloody battle, forcing Japanese defenders to flee westward, leaving behind supplies, equipment, and wounded comrades. The army was in disarray, and morale was sinking. Now it fell upon Adachi to defend more than 400 miles of coastline against a relentless enemy who dominated the sky and sea. Every attempt to send reinforcements was met with devastating air and naval attacks. Yet even with these hardships, about 60,000 Japanese troops remained in eastern New Guinea, divided among the 20th, 41st, and 51st Divisions. Each was under strength and short of supplies. In March 1943, during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, 8 transport ships carrying the 51st Division were destroyed by Allied aircraft, killing 3,000 soldiers and sinking nearly all their heavy weapons. Adachi himself narrowly escaped death when the destroyer carrying him and his staff was bombed and damaged. Around 9,000 Japanese troops formed a makeshift force to defend key airfields at Lae and Salamaua. When Australian and American forces landed nearby in June, they threatened to trap these defenders between 2 advancing Allied columns. Those who were still strong enough to march were ordered to retreat across the Saruwagd Mountains. Carrying rations for only 10 days, they set off on an incredible but tragic journey. The mountains were steep and cold, and the jungles thick and unending. Many soldiers died from hunger, exhaustion, or malaria. Few could have imagined that the mountain peaks would still be covered in snow even in July. Of the 8,600 men who began that march, only 6,400 made it out alive. The ordeal of Lae and Salamaua exposed the horrifying reality of fighting in New Guinea. The land itself was as deadly as any enemy. New Guinea, the world's second-largest island, stretched across nearly 500,000 square miles. Before the war, most of it was unmapped and unknown to the outside world. Vast swamps, thick rainforests, and rugged mountains covered its surface. Although the soil was rich and the rainfall abundant, over 100 inches a year, few plants were edible, earning the island the grim nickname, the Green Desert, among Japanese troops. The Owen Stanley Range cut through the island's center like a spine, its peaks shrouded in mist and clouds. Rivers carved deep valleys that could only be crossed by fragile wooden bridges or small boats. Along the northern coast were small native villages and a few colonial ports connected by muddy footpaths. During the rainy season, these trails turned into rivers of mud. Disease was everywhere. Malaria, typhus, and dysentery struck without mercy. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds and rats spread infections. The heat was unbearable, often rising above 100 degrees with suffocating humidity. Then the rains came, falling for months without pause. "It rained every day," recalled Sergeant Masatsu Owala of the 20th Division's 79th Regiment. "Our rifles rusted, our bayonets turned red with corrosion, and wounds refused to heal." Adachi knew his army was trapped between nature and an enemy that grew stronger every day. American bombers destroyed Japanese air power throughout 1943 and early 1944, while Allied warships and aircraft dominated the seas and skies. The small Japanese Ninth Fleet was almost wiped out, reduced to a handful of coastal patrol boats that dared to move only at night to deliver supplies. By day, the coast belonged to the Allies. Meanwhile, seasoned Australian troops from the 7th Infantry Division landed near Finschhafen on the Tuan Peninsula, pushing closer toward the heart of Adachi's defenses. Surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of everything, General Adachi faced the hardest truth of all. His army was doomed. Yet even then he refused to surrender. For him, as for many of his soldiers, Death in battle was the only honorable path left. In late September 1943, Adachi ordered another fighting retreat, pulling his battered units back west toward the strongholds at Wewak, Hansa Bay, and Madang. After a grueling 3-month march, mostly at night and over terrible ground, the 18th Army closed in on those bases. Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters was forced to rethink its defenses in the south as the war moved against them. And on September 30th, 1943, staff officers in the capital changed the Army's main defensive line across New Guinea, moving it hundreds of miles behind Adachi and in effect cutting off his 55,000 men. Command of the 18th Army was handed to a commander of the 2nd Area Army based at Davao in western New Guinea on March 14, 1944, after Adachi had been serving with the 8th Area Army in Rabaul, under Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura. The switch came because Imamura could no longer direct operations effectively while cut off from the front. The truth was that Tokyo had no workable plan to defend New Guinea with the meager resources it had, and no one in high command could stop the enemy's steady push. In the spring of 1944, Tokyo sent General Anami a flood of conflicting orders, telling Adachi both to hold important ground along the northeast coast and at the same time to pull major combat units west to the new defense line. Those orders showed little understanding of how hard it was to fight and march in New Guinea. They even tried to dictate detailed troop movements. One message absurdly demanded the 18th Army march 215 miles to Hollandia in an impossibly short time. General Anami, frustrated, wrote in his diary that Imperial General Headquarters was in chaos. Yet the 2nd Area Army commander quietly protested Tokyo's unrealistic commands, which were still passed down to Adachi for execution. From Adachi's position, 1,300 miles east, the situation looked very different. Patrols began to find signs that the Allies were preparing to invade Wewak as March turned to April. Rubber dinghies on nearby beaches hinted at seaborne reconnaissance teams, and Allied aircraft became more numerous overhead. Adachi chose to ignore orders and concentrate on defending Wewak and Hansa Bay, sending his decision by radio, not knowing that Allied cryptographers were reading every message the 18th Army sent because of a top-secret signals intelligence source. General Douglas MacArthur of the Southwest Pacific knew his deception was working. Adachi had taken the bait and was waiting at Wewak, while inflatable boats left on likely landing beaches helped sell the ruse. MacArthur also had a clear estimate of Japanese unit positions and numbers in New Guinea, and used that knowledge to his advantage. On April 22, 1944, American forces launched bold amphibious landings close to Wewak's fortified airfields at Hollandia and Aitape, gambling by inserting forces between the 18th Army and the rest of Japan's forces in the area. MacArthur trusted that intercepted Japanese radio traffic would warn U.S. commanders of Adachi's plans in time to strike. The Japanese commanders in New Guinea also wanted to attack at Wewak. Adachi and his superior Anami believed they could beat the Allied positions at Aitape and Hollandia. On April 25th, Anami moved his headquarters from Davao to Manado in the Moluccas, but Tokyo still did not see things the same way, and on May 2nd more orders arrived calling for another withdrawal, this time deeper into New Guinea's Vogelkop Peninsula. Once again, Anami told the 18th Army to move west and link up with his forces to defend the Vogelkop, but American operations cut all communications between Adachi's command and the 2nd Area Army on May 27 when they invaded Biak on June 20th. On June 20th, the 18th Army was subordinated directly to Southern Army headquarters in Singapore, a sign that Tokyo had no real way to help, and was effectively leaving Adachi and his men to fend for themselves, merely ordering them to hold ground where possible. Adachi had long learned to think for himself as well as to obey. His military tradition required initiative even if that meant disobeying orders, and like many Japanese officers, he had vowed to give his life to protect his emperor and country. His choice was clear. The 18th Army would attack and, if necessary, die with honor. "We desire honor," he wrote in May, "and if we cannot have both life and honor, we should throw away life and keep honor." He presented his officers with a plan to seize Aitape, codenamed Operation A. On May 5th, long-range reconnaissance teams set out on foot to study the American positions and report back, while soldiers from the 20th and 41st Divisions began concentrating at Wewak. After moving out of Madang and Hansa Bay, about 5,000 riflemen between those divisions were Adachi's strongest troops, but they had the longest march to make. Wewak lay roughly 200 trail miles from Madang. The 51st Division, except for a single regiment, stayed behind as a rear guard to slow any Australian advance from the east. Some 3,000 convalescing soldiers remained in hospital, and many able men, up to 6 for every combat soldier at the front, were tied up as porters carrying rations, ammunition, and even bits of mountain artillery. In all, roughly 35,000 Japanese troops set out for Aitape in May and June 1944. On May 10th, a landing barge carrying the 20th Division commander, Lieutenant General Shigeru Katagiri, hit an Allied mine off Wewak. Katagiri and his staff were killed, a blow that badly undermined Adachi's campaign. A later airstrike killed 6 senior officers of the 41st Division, creating another leadership crisis that soon would be keenly felt. Adachi himself led the main column toward Aitape as was his custom, while his capable chief of staff, Lieutenant General Yoshiharu Ishibashi, remained at Wewak with the nearly impossible task of keeping supplies moving for the army. Ishibashi's men carried whatever food and ammunition they could, but it was never enough. Survivors of the 3rd Battalion, 80th Infantry Regiment recalled receiving less than 12 ounces of rice per man each day, with biscuits arriving only every 2 or 3 days, and a mere 3 precious cigarettes issued to each man every 10 days. Many soldiers supplemented this meager fare with sago palm and whatever else they could find. But as the unclean, exhausted columns pushed west, malnutrition set in. Adachi had given his troops an 8-mile daily goal at first, a reasonable target given New Guinea's terrible terrain, but that figure was soon halved. Stragglers littered every column and supply convoys all but stopped. For men forced to march through jungle, it was a living nightmare. Salt and medicines were nearly non-existent, and then the rains came, turning trails into rivers of mud. It was awful to march in the rain, remembered Sergeant Masatsu Ogawa of the 20th Division. Drops soaked my cap and mixed with my sweat. You staggered, got up, fell, and looked like a line of marching mud dolls. You just slogged through the murky water, trailing the legs of the man ahead of you. Men began to die along the trail. Those who had struggled before left bodies and the signs of suffering along the way. It was a terrible sight. Road markers pushed Ogawa forward past the remains of his fallen comrades, some reduced to skeletons by the heat and rot. The bodies seemed to point the way, as if to say, "Follow us, and you will reach your goal." The promise of American rations captured at Aitape, and the soldiers' stubborn will drove them onward. Seeing their commanding general share every hardship with them gave them more reason to keep moving. He hid a painful hernia behind a calm face, so few knew how badly he suffered. And because enemy aircraft made daytime movement too dangerous, the troops marched at night and tried to rest in the rainforest by day. At dawn they ate whatever little food they found and imagined the feasts they hoped would come after victory. Every morning Adachi, by radio, unknowingly told Allied codebreakers where his columns were gathering, so MacArthur knew the positions and plans of Adachi's forces. The Americans at Aitape readied themselves for the expected attack, while Australian signal teams trailed the Japanese march across New Guinea. Task Force Persecution, commanded in the field by Major William H. Gill, held positions 8 miles east of Aitape at Taji. Gill's airfields formed a semicircle around most of his defenses, but he deployed a covering force to the banks of the Draw River 15 miles east to get early warning of any Japanese advance. Brigadier General Clarence A. Martin led this covering force of about 3,500 riflemen, backed by artillery, armor, PT boats, and close air support from Bristol Beaufort bombers of No. 71 Wing, Royal Australian Air Force. On May 22nd, advance elements of Adachi's 20th Division nearly trapped an American reconnaissance patrol near the coastal village of Nap, the first clash between the forces. In early June, a larger fight broke out at Yakal, 3 miles west of Nayap, when soldiers from the 78th and 80th Infantry Regiments ambushed an entire U.S. battalion. Japanese troops watched in frustration as Allied landing craft arrived in time to rescue the last company pinned on the beach. By then, Generals Gill and Martin were convinced that Adachi's arrival was imminent. They found further proof in Japanese operational orders captured later that month, though the exact timing and place of the attack remained unclear. The 18th Army's strong counter-reconnaissance kept Allied ground patrols from penetrating Japanese screens. He personally handed out the final attack orders, no longer relying on radio contact, because his long-range reconnaissance patrols had mapped enemy troop numbers, airfield defenses, supply dumps, aid stations, and command posts with reliable detail. The Japanese also knew the Americans were stretched thin. 3 battalions were spread over a 6-mile front, leaving positions vulnerable. Adachi urged his commanders to strike before the enemy could strengthen their river defenses. He planned a direct frontal assault for the night of July 10th-11th. 3 infantry regiments would cross the Dror at midnight, overwhelm the American positions, and then regroup to push toward Task Force Persecution's main defenses around the Taji airfields. A 10-minute artillery barrage would precede the assault, a supporting coastal attack by elements of the 41st Division under Lieutenant Colonel Goro Mano and the 20th Division under Major Masaru Nikai aimed to destroy American artillery near the river mouth. The 237th Infantry Regiment of Mano's 41st Division, commanded by Colonel Masahiko Nara, was to lead the main effort on the Dror. Colonels Tokutaro Ide and Natsuhiro Matsumoto led the 20th Division's 80th and 78th Infantry Regiments on Nara's left, while Major Yaro Hoshino of the 41st Mountain Artillery commanded the coastal assault force. Reservists from the 66th Infantry of the 51st Division were attached as Army reserves. The Dror River starts high in the tessellated mountains and bends north toward the coast near a cluster of aboriginal huts called Afua, about 6 miles from the sea. At that point, the river was waist-deep and slow, flanked by tall reeds and averaging roughly 100 yards across. Small islands, most notably one the Japanese called Konak Kashima, helped guide the attackers' approach. Even though Adachi had detailed knowledge of his enemy, he still missed key facts. American infantrymen had placed probable artillery targets and strung barbed wire before their fighting positions. A full 3,000-man American regiment sat in reserve nearby, and 5 battalions, 2 dismounted cavalry and 3 infantry, were dug in along the Dror front. The Japanese did not know that Major General Gill had been replaced by U.S. Army Commander Major General Charles P. Hall to lead Task Force Persecution. Hall planned to destroy the 18th Army rather than let Adachi mass against his lines. Yielding to pressure from MacArthur, Hall sent 2 battalion-sized patrols from the persecution covering. Force on July 10th, 1, moved along the coast and the other headed south toward Afua to find and destroy this phantom threat so Allied troops could be freed for the upcoming Philippines campaign. The timing was awful. Both patrols, lost in the thick rainforest, failed to find the 18th Army, which was finishing final preparations for its assault that evening. To make matters worse, Hall pulled those 2 battalions off the Dror line instead of keeping them in reserve, significantly weakening the covering force when it was most needed. Adachi's attack plans also suffered last-minute blows. The 237th, the strongest unit, arrived late and skipped important reconnaissance. The 78th and 80th regiments in the 20th Division were mixed up and disorganized, leaving officers little time to sort things before the assault began. An unexpected American artillery barrage at 2350 on July 10th stunned soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 128th Infantry Regiment, and pinned them deep in their foxholes under machine gun and mortar fire. Then thousands of Japanese troops rose and charged as parachute flares lit the sky. Adachi's attack began 5 minutes early under Major Moritoshi Kawai Gashi, when 400 men from the 1st Battalion, 78th Infantry Regiment, surged forward. It was a horrible sight as Ogawa moved forward, following road markers past the bodies of his dead comrades, some already little more than skeletons from the heat and rot. The corpses seemed to point the way, and the promise of captured American rations at Itape, along with the soldiers' stubborn will, pushed them onward, especially since their commanding general shared every hardship with them, and hid a painful hernia behind a calm face while they marched at night to avoid enemy aircraft. They rested by day in the rainforest, ate what little they could find, and dreamed of the feasts they hoped to get after victory. Every morning, Adachi's radio messages unknowingly told Allied codebreakers where his columns were, so MacArthur and his staff knew roughly where the Japanese forces were gathering and prepared. Australian signal teams also tracked the Japanese march. Task Force Persecution, under Major General William H. Gill, held positions 8 miles east of Itape at Taji, and Gill placed a covering force on the Draw River banks 15 miles east, under Brigadier General Clarence A. Martin. About 3,500 riflemen backed by artillery, armor, PT boats, and close air support from Royal Australian Air Force Beaufort bombers. On May 22, elements of Adachi's 20th Division nearly trapped an American reconnaissance patrol near the coastal village of Nayap, and in early June, soldiers of the 78th and 80th Regiments ambushed a U.S. battalion at Yakal, 3 miles west of Nayap, though Allied landing craft managed to rescue the last company pinned on the beach. Gill and Martin grew convinced Adachi was coming after they later captured Japanese operational orders, but the exact time and place remained unclear because the 18th Army's strong counter-reconnaissance screen kept Allied patrols out, and misleading ultra-intercepts gave false confidence. MacArthur's intelligence had guessed a June 15th attack, but when that date passed, many Americans thought the Japanese were withdrawing to Wewak, and by July 1st contact was lost along the Dror line while Adachi's radio fell silent. Unseen in the jungle east of the Dror, about 20,000 Japanese combat troops were gathering, and although Adachi delayed repeatedly because of supply shortages, movement delays, and exhausted men, by the second week of July, he judged his forces ready and personally handed out final orders after long-range reconnaissance patrols mapped enemy numbers, airfields, supply dumps, aid stations, and command posts. The Japanese knew the Americans were spread thin along a 6-mile front and urged a preemptive strike before the enemy could reinforce. The plan called for a frontal assault at midnight on July 10th, the 11th. 3 regiments would cross the Dror, smash the American positions, regroup, then push toward Task Force Persecution's main defenses at Taji after a 10-minute artillery preparation. A supporting coastal attack by the 41st and 20th Divisions would try to silence American artillery near the river mouth. The main effort was to be led by the 237th Infantry of the 41st Division under Colonel Masahiko Nara, with the 80th and 78th Regiments on the left and mountain artillery and reserves attached. The Dror rose in the tessellated mountains and ran north toward the coast near Afua, where it was waist-deep and slow with tall reeds and an average width of about 100 yards. Islands such as Konak Kashima marked the crossing points. Despite good intelligence, Adachi missed some things. American infantry had laid probable artillery targets and barbed wire. A full 3,000-man regiment was in nearby reserve, and 5 battalions were dug in along the Dror front. Unaware that Major General Gill had been replaced by Major General Charles P. Hall, the Japanese did not know Hall planned to destroy the 18th Army rather than let it mass against his lines. Under pressure from MacArthur, Hall sent 2 battalion patrols on July 10th to find this threat, but both got lost in the rainforest and failed to locate Adachi's forces, and then Hall pulled those battalions off the Dror line, weakening his covering force just when it was most needed. Adachi's plans also suffered. The 237th arrived late and skipped crucial reconnaissance. The 78th and 80th were mixed and disorganized, and an unexpected American artillery barrage at 2350 on July 10th pinned men of the 2nd Battalion, 128th Infantry deep in their foxholes under machine gun and mortar fire. Then thousands of Japanese surged forward as parachute flares lit the sky. They dashed for the river just before midnight and reached halfway across before American artillery and automatic weapons positions opened up, stalling the attack. Kawaii-Gashi's men were nearly wiped out within minutes, dead or wounded along the Dror banks, while another group of riflemen broke through reeds on Kawaii-Gashi's right flank. Amid the chaos, one company mistakenly landed on Kakushima Island and was cut down by small arms fire, and Yoshida's 1st Battalion, leading the main effort, was hammered by mortars, grenades, and cannon until it was destroyed by flying metal fragments. After a time, the enemy howitzers shifted targets and the battlefield fell eerily quiet. But then more Japanese soldiers climbed over the bodies of their comrades and pressed forward. American defenders watched with horror as screams, officers' shouts, and relentless gunfire filled the air, while smoke and dust hid barbed wire and trenches, and many Japanese died trying to cross the obstacles. Still, sheer numbers and shortages of ammunition began to silence some American machine guns, and mortars and artillery held fire for fear of hitting their own men. Company E of the 128th Infantry was overrun to the north, and by dawn on July 11th, the Japanese had torn a 2,000-yard hole in the defenses, forcing the persecution-covering force, including the 2 patrol battalions, to fall back about 3 miles west and abandon huge stores of supplies and equipment to the jubilant Japanese, though Adachi paid a heavy price of over 800 dead. The men who had crossed were scattered and ill-prepared. Many officers were killed and some, like Colonel Nara, vanished for days. Allied howitzers and fighter bombers continually harassed the crossing sites and probable concentration points, but optimism still held at Adachi's command post. On July 13th, Major Hino's Coastal Attack Force reported ambushing a U.S. counterattack, knocking out 2 tanks and inflicting casualties, and reconnaissance said the Americans were still retreating. So Japanese reinforcements streamed west across the Dror. That picture was incomplete, however, for Hall and Gill were already planning a counterattack with 5 full-strength infantry battalions, 2 cavalry squadrons and naval air, and artillery support to retake the Dror, close the gap, and destroy the 18th Army. Late on July 13th, the Americans struck back under a rolling artillery barrage that hit Major Hosino's troops, and M-10 tank destroyers and rocket-firing landing craft supported the push from the sea. By dusk, Allied firepower had cut off and largely neutralized the remnants of Hino's coastal force. With the Americans holding the river mouth, the 128th Infantry moved south to link up with the 112th Cavalry, which was pushing north from Afua, but thousands of Japanese still stood between them, low on ammunition but with captured rations filling their bellies. On July 14th, Adachi reorganized and combined the 78th and 80th Regiments under Major General Saburo Miyake of the 20th Division, after their heavy losses. This so-called Macaca force seized a jungle ridge northwest of Afua that blocked the advance of the U.S. 112th Cavalry. The center of the Dror River line at Afua became a vital crossroads that both sides fought over for nearly a month, with the tiny cluster of 10 native huts changing hands at least 6 times in late July and early August, while sickness, ambushes, and exhaustion kept bleeding Macaca force's strength. The fighting along the Dror showed how brutal a long struggle in New Guinea could be. Both sides guarded isolated strongpoints that were not decisive. Both had poor reconnaissance and bad maps, and many clashes were accidental in the broken jungle terrain. By the end of July, Adachi and his American opponents were preparing for a final, decisive battle for Aitape. For the 18th Army, it would be a fight to the death. In a later letter, Adachi's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Yoshiharu Ishibashi, said the men had run out of food and ammunition and could neither fight effectively nor survive much longer. Time ran out for the Japanese as well. A cavalry regiment and 3 U.S. infantry divisions were now at Aitape, and on July 31st, Major General Hall sent 4 rifle battalions from the river mouth to encircle the 18th Army from the rear, leaving the 41st Division little room to stop them. The decisive battle for Afua began on August 1st, with the 66th Infantry preparing a last-ditch flank attack, while Japanese artillery used its remaining shells to batter enemy positions. The 66th led a final charge across the Dror, with survivors from the 20th and 41st Divisions, but the ground turned into a quagmire of splintered trees, shell craters, and knee-deep mud after weeks of shelling and rain. The attackers paid heavy losses and made little ground, and by dusk, Adachi reluctantly ordered the starving remnants of the once proud 18th Army to begin a painful retreat toward Wewak, Over the next days, small attacks served mainly to cover the main force's withdrawal. Allied patrols near the drawer found horror. What looked like logs in the stream were hundreds of dead Japanese, and the 18th Army had been almost destroyed in this campaign. Estimates put nearly 10,000 killed or missing, though exact numbers may never be known, and the heaviest losses fell on infantry units. For example, the 7th Regiment went into the fight with 1,300 men and came out with only 350, a 73% loss. Task Force Persecution reported 2,550 wounded, 10 missing, and 440 killed. U.S. patrols chased Adachi's forces toward Wewak for weeks, clashing with rear guards until Major General Hall declared the Aitape operation over on August 25th. But the ordeal for the 18th Army continued after Wewak fell to the Australian 6th Division in May 1945, forcing the garrison to flee into the mountains where they stayed until the war ended. Only about 13,000 of the roughly 150,000 Japanese who served in New Guinea with Adachi survived to be taken prisoner. Adachi himself was later tried and convicted of war crimes for atrocities committed by his troops against Allied prisoners and civilians in New Guinea, and given life imprisonment. But on September 10, 1947, he took his own life with a short knife. Like many of the men he led, he never returned home. His remains rest in a remote Pacific cemetery. The account was written by Patrick J. Chasen, a retired U.S. Army officer from Scotia, New York, who was a regular contributor.